Problem of evil. The problem of evil is a positive argument for atheism. Atheism is not the default position when all theistic arguments fail. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The problem of evil is one of the only reasons atheists have to support their position. The person who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. And it's our turn, the turn of the Christian, to be skeptical of their claims. So we're going to have a definition of evil. St. Augustine's definition of evil is a privation of good, or a lack of good. For example, dark is the absence of light, cold is the absence of warmth, and a hole in a shirt is the absence of the material. And there's two different causes for evil, or suffering for that matter. Moral evil, which is murder, rape, or oppression, and natural evil, such as tsunamis, earthquakes, and floods. But did God create evil? Here's an argument for God creating evil. Premise 1, God created everything. Premise 2, evil is a thing. And conclusion, therefore, God created evil. But St. Augustine's response using his definition is that evil is not a thing. Evil is a lack of something, which is good. And there's another way to look at it. Looking at premise 1, there's a problem in the statement that God created everything. We can say that God made evil possible, but he did not make evil actual. God is the formal cause, man is the efficient cause. So why would he make evil possible? If the love of God is to be made possible, moral freedom is logically necessary, and in order for moral freedom to exist, the possibility of evil is logically necessary. So we're going to look at the logical version of the problem of evil, which says it's impossible for God and evil to coexist. If one exists, then the other does not. It's like an irresistible force and an immovable object. If one exists, the other can't possibly exist. The coexistence of suffering and a God who is all good and all powerful is logically impossible. Since suffering obviously exists, it follows that God does not exist. It's improbable that God and suffering. Oh, well, here's the probabilistic version. It's improbable that God and suffering coexist. It's very unlikely given the amount of evil and suffering in the world. The amount of suffering in the world makes it improbable that an all-loving, all-powerful God exists. But does God have sufficient reason to allow the amount of suffering that exists within the world? The suffering in the world provides evidence that there is no God. In other words, it seems unlikely that God could have morally sufficient reason for permitting the amount of suffering that exists within the world. Therefore, the suffering in the world provides evidence that there is no God. Let's look at a refutation of the logical version of the problem of evil. The claim of the logical version is that the following statements are logically inconsistent. An all-loving, all-powerful God exists, and suffering exists. Why are statement 1 and 2 inconsistent? 1 and 2 are not explicitly contradictory. There must be some hidden assumptions. The atheist is thinking that there must be some implicit contradiction between 1 and 2, and he must be making some assumptions which would bring out the contradiction to make it explicit. And those hidden assumptions are statement 3, if God is all-powerful, he can make any world he wants. And statement 4, if God is all-loving, then he would prefer a world without suffering. The atheist is arguing that because God is all-powerful, he can create a world without suffering, from statement 3, and because God is all good, he wouldn't want to create a world without suffering, from statement 4. From these hidden assumptions, it follows that suffering should not exist, but suffering does exist. Therefore, a God that is all-powerful and all good cannot exist. For this argument to be valid, both of the hidden assumptions made by the atheist have to be necessarily true. They cannot be possibly false. The burden of proof lies on the one making this argument to prove that the assumptions are true. Is statement 3 necessarily true? If not, not. It's not necessarily true if it's at least possible that people have genuine free will. So let's look at forced choice. Is forced choice possible? Forced choice is logically impossible. It's logically impossible to make someone freely do something, like making a round square or a married bachelor. You can't really say that someone has free will if you can force them to do anything you want without them having a choice. In statement 4, if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. Is it necessarily true? It is at least possible that God could have good overriding reasons for permitting the suffering that exists in the world. How do we know that he doesn't? The atheist's burden of proof is this question: are we warranted in assuming that because the suffering looks unjustified that it really is unjustified? We're not in a position to make that kind of judgment with any confidence. From God's wider framework, suffering may very well be justified. Whatever improbability suffering may cast upon God's existence is simply outweighed by the arguments for the existence of God, which include the traditional cosmological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, the teleological argument from cosmic fine-tuning, the teleological argument from design, features, and life, the ontological argument, the moral argument, the argument from consciousness, the argument from fulfilled Bible prophecy, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and objective personal experience. So there's doctrines within Christianity that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering, which include that the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. Mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. The knowledge of God is an incommensurable good. And take this passage from 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. We do not lose heart, for this momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things which are seen, but to the things which are unseen. For the things that are unseen are transient, that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. The problem of evil is a problem for atheists. On a superficial level, suffering calls into question God's existence, yet at a deeper level, evil actually proves God's existence. Consider the moral argument. Much of the suffering in the world consists of evil acts which people perpetrate on one another. If this is true, we may argue as follows. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Evil exists. Therefore, objective moral values exist. Therefore God exists. If the atheist is claiming that suffering ought not to be, he is making a moral judgment that is possible only if God exists.